But again, the defenders say, well, this was American foreign policy at the time, and that he was simply carrying out what was the deemed law of the land or practice of foreign policy at the time. What's your response to that line of defense?
It's been found beyond doubt by minute investigation in Washington that nobody in Congress, which has the power of the purse in these matters and the power to decide, ever knew that the National Security Advisor of President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, had evolved a plan to murder the head of the General Staff in a democratic country, not contiguous to but neighboring the United States, a democracy with which the United States was not at war. No one was ever told of that plan. We know of no authorization for Kissinger to have carried it out.
Let alone the bombing of Cambodia.
The bombing of Cambodia was likewise concealed from Congress. It's flattering to the American people. They have to be lied to so much, I sometimes think.
All right, that was the late Christopher Hitchens talking about the unfortunately not yet late Henry Kissinger. And I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined by the full crew this week. We've got our producer, Jake Appett, our YouTube manager, Kelly Carey, and our graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And of course, that what Hitchens was talking about there is what he talks about a lot in this book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, which was, basically one of the last good books that Hitchens wrote. And it was about how, like he was making the case for doing a literal trial of Henry Kissinger, putting him on trial for crimes against humanity, for his involvement in everything from the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, democratic socialist elected president, following the death squad reign of terror by Pinochet, which Kissinger was very heavily involved in. Kissinger infamously said, "I don't see why Chile should be allowed to go communist simply because its voters are irresponsible." To the bombing of Cambodia, where Kissinger infamously passed on to the Pentagon what he talked about with Nixon, which was the instructions: anything that flies and anything that moves, and similar horrors in East Timor and Cyprus and other places. But in any case, the connection between what we're about to talk about and Kissinger is not immediately going to be obvious. We're going to get to it. And by the way, if you're saying, where's Žižek, we're going to be back, we're going to be doing the Žižek interview, within, 5 minutes or so. But let's stick with Kissinger. And again, connection's not going to be obvious right away. Give it a second. But right now, Elizabeth Holmes is on trial for, massively defrauding and endangering people with her supposedly miraculous blood testing machine, for company Theranos, which is supposed to take one prick of blood and, supposed to be like a home test that would, instantly do like 1,000 blood testing codes, which would have been an amazing life-saving thing, except of course that, it was made up. In fact, it was so made up, I think we have a graphic of this, that when asked to explain how it worked, this is what Elizabeth Holmes said. Quote, I love this because this shows that she knows about as much about medical science as I do, right? She says, and I quote, "A chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified laboratory personnel." So, there you go. A chemistry is performed. That's how it works. But, she was actually wrote something for Jackman about this. Should be out in the next day or two. She was a, tyrannical and weird boss. She had, made sure that like the engineers weren't talking to the chemists and vice versa. There were a lot of like dramatic summary firings. She had to have the temperature constantly set to like the low 60s. So it'd be cold enough for her to wear her like daily uniform of a black turtleneck and a puffy jacket, which she wore because it made her look like Steve Jobs. But whatever her failings in many, many other areas, one thing she was really, really good at was talking rich people out of their money. A lot of money, in fact. She had $700 million of money from wealthy investors. And quite a bit of that, like at least like 3/5 of that, came from Kissinger and his friends. Because Kissinger, he has, the estimates I saw range anywhere from a net worth of like 10 million to 50 million, something like that. But, so he's poor compared to these other people that we're talking about. But, he devoted 3 million of his possibly as little as 10 million to invest in Theranos. But like a bunch of friends, people who found out about it through Kissinger and through Kissinger's estate lawyer, because Kissinger was so excited about the project. So the Walton family, for example, about 3 other incredibly wealthy families accounted for, you put them all together, about 3/5 of it. And I guess my big thought about this is that the more I read about this, Elizabeth Holmes, is a bad person who did bad things. But, I don't know, man. I just kept thinking about, this passage that's always stuck with me for the introduction to that Hitchens book, where he says, yet the pudgy man standing in a black tie at the Vogue party is not surely the man who ordered and sanctioned the destruction of civilian populations, the assassination of inconvenient politicians, the kidnapping and disappearance of soldiers and clerics and journalists who've gone his way. Oh, but he is exactly the same man. I just, there is a little part of me that wishes that it had been a few more years before she got caught, and she could have sucked a lot more money out of all of these people.
Yeah, it's definitely a strange question of how these war criminals, these elite war criminals, how they, what do they do to pass the time and the intervening? I mean, he probably thought he would be dead a lot, so he used to figure out how to pass the time. And I guess this is how he does it. But I think you're right that she has a gift. I wonder what, how you whisper to these people to, get the money out of them.
Kissinger is an insane lunatic, but the Vogue party thing, I think if you have any politicians and I mean, this is just, and not specifically, Christopher Hitchens is talking about kind of New York society, and like, it's difficult entry if you're not born into it, and or impossible. So, the politicians mingling with these people at any type of party like that, they're all criminals. I mean, the things that they've done. Kissinger takes the cake, though. I mean, it's like I said to you, Ben. We might be living in hell. That it could be proof, guys. Come on, like, I rarely think that, and I don't believe in it. But him still being alive, like, having a good time. I think he is. What?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And of course, you're right. I mean, it's a good point about the Vogue parties, because, and it goes to the Theranos story too, because Kissinger is very far from being alone as being like a sort of like creepy ultra elite lizard person who Holmes managed to talk a good game to about her amazing machine and get them in on it. Bill Clinton, there's tons of footage you can find on YouTube of Clinton hanging out with Elizabeth Holmes and doing the like hosting her at the Clinton Global Initiative. Hillary Clinton actually during the 2016 primaries, at which point a lot of this stuff had already come out, like still had a fundraiser scheduled at Theranos, and like there were like a bunch of like there's a bunch of embarrassing media coverage about it before they're finally like, okay, I guess we can hold it somewhere else, but like she was, that was her gift, I guess, right? She managed to, she had the Steve Jobs uniform, the black turtleneck and the jacket. She had a deep voice, doesn't blink much, manages to sound really charismatic about the project. And I guess the one thing that does seem like a real takeaway for me for all this and is that like there is a connection here between crazy economic inequality and the possibility of stuff like Theranos existed. Because, if she was just trying to fund this by like getting like government research grants or something, or even like loans from like a bank officer, those institutions that have to go through levels of approval bureaucracy and like, there'd be a lot of chances for somebody to be like, wait, how does this work? It's a chemistry is performing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Can we have some kind of like third party, observer in here to like show us how it works? But whereas if you're crazy rich, right? Like even if you're Henry Kissinger, you got a few $1 million to spend on it. And certainly if you're the Waltons and, you could spend like just ungodly amounts of money on it. You don't have to justify yourself to anybody. I mean, like as long as, you might hire somebody to check it out for you. But once you're convinced, like there's nobody else who has to sign off on it. You can just spend the money.
Ben, that's all just red tape, actually figuring out if it works, review processes. That's just, needless red tape that slows down innovation, like Theranos is what we're learning here. But it's funny talking about these evil parties. The richest wedding I've ever been to. We were talking to this nice little old lady, and we were saying, so what do you do around here? And she's like, I'm on the board of my local library, and we invite speakers, to come speak. And we just had Henry Kissinger, for example, speak. What do you? And it was like me and like 3 other millennials, and I was pretty deep in a few, champagne or whatever I was drinking, and I just said, I actually whispered like fucking war criminal under my breath, and I was like, it's not worth it. And then I went to the dance floor, but I had access to power there, but I squandered it, I think.
To think you could have got funded for millions at that party.
Exactly.
Yeah, really what you should do is, you should have been like, look, I have a machine that stops time, and I really think Dr. Kissinger, should invest in this exciting revolutionary new project.
Yeah, all we need is 30% of his net worth and access to the most evil billionaires on the planet, and then we'll be off to the races.
And a quart of his lizard blood.
Exactly.
I'm still stuck on Hillary Clinton having to be pushed to move the event. I mean, can we be any stupider? I mean, I don't consider myself a Democrat, I guess, but
yeah, right.
The other day I got an email, and I subscribe to a lot of newsletters or whatever, but the headline was, "Does the Democratic Party have a messaging problem?" And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? And just deleted it immediately. I don't know who it was from. I was like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, it might have been from like the LA Times. It wasn't from nobody, you know what I mean? And it's just like, are you seriously asking that question? Like, yes, there's a messaging problem. There's lots of problems. Cause like if Hillary Clinton and her whole team had to be convinced that was a bad idea, I do not understand what was going on. I mean, if I was working on that campaign, I would have been like, I am willing to get fired to be like, move the event. This is insanity. This is insane. Like, what is happening? Like, this is when people go in, like, people like Hillary Clinton maybe go and they overthink things, or like whatever they're doing, and they have no connection to actual reality for normal people.
Yeah, no, I think that's for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot a lot to say about that. And this kind of what we were talking with Harvey K about last week, about the Virginia election and how your Republicans can like whip people up into a frenzy about, I don't know, they're going to teach our kids critical race theory or whatever, whatever the sort of dumb, culture war shit they're doing that week is. But the problem is that unless like Donald Trump is actually on the ballot to like scare people, it's really hard to see what like centrist Dems like Terry McAuliffe or whoever, like have to go, to sort of counteract that, right? Because all they could do is sort of remind people of how bad Trump was, but you can't run on that for forever. And yeah, I mean it's hard to like get people excited about like populist economic appeals while you're doing fundraisers with Theranos and talking about how Henry Kissinger is your BFF, which Hillary Clinton was also doing in 2016. All right, we should do the preview for the Patreon episode from last Saturday, and then get to Slavoj Zizek. So, thanks, guys.
All right, see ya.
Lawrence Becker, in his book A New Stoicism, he says, "What would Stoicism have been like if it hadn't disappeared in the early Middle Ages and it actually had come into contact with all these other thinkers?" That's what we have to do. We can't just say, well, Seneca said, and then for that reason we ignore what Marx had to say, or Nietzsche had to say, or Mary Wollstonecraft had to say, or pick whoever, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, right. I mean, Seneca is also an interesting example for the political justice issue, right? Because my understanding is that, I mean, there's maybe a limit to how much you can blame anybody for their students' application.
Nero was not applying anything that Seneca taught him,
Okay.
And it's one of those sort of things where sort of like I forget who says this, but somebody's like, oh, you claim to be a Christian and look at what a bad guy you are. And he says, just think about what I'd be like if I wasn't a Christian.
Right.
Wasn't holding me back a little bit.
Right. So without the Stoicism, who knows what Nero would have done?
I mean, you know what the usual criticism of Seneca is he was a rich hypocrite. He was very wealthy, and he talks a lot about how we have to do this Stoic practice and all that, but it's not like he spent his money helping people do that.
Right. Yeah. So we've got it seems like something that the Stoic thinkers spend a lot of time thinking about is how to sort of be prepared for death, how to be sort of reconciled with the inevitability of death. So we've got about a minute left. How do I do that?
Oh, well, the traditional thing is you think about it every day, and you don't think about it like in a morbid way or a way that's going to terrify you. You do it in like little doses, what they call. The fancy name is premeditatio malorum. It just means thinking about bad things in advance, and you don't have to do it just with death. I mean, you can think about like, oh, I'm going to have to give this talk, and what if it goes bad? What if everybody hates me? And then you kind of think about, well, how bad actually is this? And it sounds kind of hokey, new agey, but turns out it actually does help. When you experiment with it.
Microdose.
Exactly.
Thoughts about death.
Yeah. Microdosing. That's a good way to put it.
All right. So that was Gregory Sadler, who is a philosophy professor who does philosophy, talks about philosophy on YouTube. So of course we had to have him on the show at some point. It's a really interesting conversation. We got into moral luck and Stoicism and some of his experiences teaching philosophy classes in prison. So really, really interesting conversation that dropped for patrons on Saturday. Just as a reminder, if you join the Give Them an Argument Patreons, that's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, BURGIS. You get that bonus episode every Saturday, patron exclusive episode. You also get the patron exclusive post game after every regular Monday night show. Post game tonight, the great Gene Bajalan is going to join us. We're going to talk about Prager. We're going to break down PragerU's video about how awesome the British Empire was. Should be a good time. And you get quite a bit. You get quite a bit else. Other benefits. There's access to the Discord server. We've done Discord movie nights and other things. But most importantly, it's solidarity. It's support. If you like the work we do here, it helps us do it. So no further ado. We did have to pre-record the interview with Slavoj because, I talked to him 4 or 5 times. I can just be familiar with Slavoj. Because right now it is about 2:30 in the morning in Slovenia, and he does not stay up this late. But it's a really good conversation. We're going to play it straight through. And then for the philosophy segment after that, Professor Jennifer Burgess is still out sick like she was last week. She is getting better, and also it's definitely not COVID. She has been tested. But Matt McManus is going to fill in for her, and we are going to get into the question of whether Immanuel Kant was a critical race theorist, as has recently been suggested in the pages of the Washington Post. But meanwhile, here's my conversation with Slavoj Zizek. So haven't talked in public in a little while. What's it like in Slovenia right now?
Bad. I mean, I don't know how it is today, but a couple of days ago, we were number 1 in the world by how many infections per million and so on and so on. But it's something strange going on. Although we have many people dying daily, intensive care units are full. Nonetheless, if you go around, life looks normal. People mostly walk around without masks. Mm-hmm. But it's not, I will put it in very naive terms, it's not a true spontaneous joy, the nightmare is over. It's something very morbid and indifferent. It's as if we are too tired even to care. And the line of the government is, but economy is doing well. So we are here in a very dangerous deadlock. On the one hand, the conservative nationalist government puts the blame on leftist opposition. This is the official theory that leftist, by leftist, I mean mostly this corrupted liberal center, so the government line is that the leftist opposition prefers thousands hospitalized, people dying and so on, just to hurt the government. That their main point is ruin the government. So since government is running the vaccination and so on, we should make it fail. On the other hand, recently there was a large group of, how should I call it, independent protesters against COVID measures, which were not specifically left. But the danger is that opposing the government, for unfortunately many people, opposing the right-wing nationalist government is perceived by some people as equal to resisting COVID measures. You know, this very dangerous short.
Okay, so that's really interesting, because I've always just FYI, we're getting a little bit of echo, so maybe you turn down your volume a little bit. But that is interesting. Like I've wondered about that in the U.S. case. Like, you know, sometimes I wonder, like, if Donald Trump had come out, you know, when the pandemic started in favor of, really strong, measures and lockdowns, and he wanted to stay locked down. And, I've always wondered if we would have gotten like, liberal, anti-mask, anti-vaccination people as a reaction to that.
I know, but I think I was also tempted to simplify the situation in way you described it now, but I think what's so interesting is that on the one hand, the left and the right, the new right against state terror and so on, big corporations even, and some strings of the left, not only abroad, like Fabio Vigi, who attacked me, but even in Slovenia now, more and more leftist theorists go to field of investment.
Because I've always just
so, and the same with threat of global warming. For them, this is a pseudo problem. Pseudo problem in the sense that it was invented by capital, who can no longer expand along the old lines. This was invented by the big capital to open up a new field of investments. That again, it shouldn't be taken seriously. Right. Of course, for me, even if this is not directly formulated as conspiracy theory, this is, as I repeat again and again, a way too optimistic theory. First, it's paranoiac. Just imagine taking this seriously, what this means. Right. Seriously, literally. This means that some big international body of top capitalists, I don't know how, is capable of triggering, controlling, and so on, an event which, so we were reported, first exploded in China, then gradually spread, and so on and so on. So again, the theory is that we shouldn't be tricked by these tensions between United States, China, and so on and so on. Behind all these, there is a secret capitalist body of coordination. This, for me, is a little bit too much. And as I already repeatedly pointed out, this is the pessimist side, the conspiracy theory side. But there is also a way to optimist side aspect for me. It is as if we just have to ignore this paranoia, return to life as normal, and the specter of any danger, global warming, pandemic, will disappear. My point, which I repeat, I know I'm repetitive here, but one has to repeat it again and again, is that such reading, although it pretends to be critical of capitalism, underestimates what I cannot but call the material impact of capitalism. Capitalism is not just a speculative dance of playing on the stock market, futures, all these reflective moves. There is also a material reality at work here, which is global warming, incredible amounts of trash, of pollution. Look what's happening with our seas, general levels of contamination, and so on and so on. Capitalism is not just an incredible financial and productive dynamic. Capitalism is also, that's the other side of capitalism, this immense quantity of new trash, which is just laying out there literally the remainder, the immobilized stuff that is just lying there. That's the truth. So my point is that there is no need to invent crises. Capitalism produces them spontaneously. That's one danger I see. Again, I am not saying that capital is not exploiting this crisis for further control and so on and so on. But as I put it in one of my late texts, we are blackmailed by reality here. You know, the problem is real. And the problem is that we don't have an alternative. So our answer should not be let's ignore the problem, but provide a better alternative.
Yeah,
more publicly open. That's crucial. If we don't play this game, if we just adopt this strategy of it's a dark plot by capital, all invented and so on,
well,
we will really end up in a situation where we will be totally at the disposal of capitalist manipulations.
Yeah, I mean, I also wonder if it might be too optimistic in the sense that it suggests that, you know, there's always a sense in which conspiracy theories feel really optimistic because at least somebody is in control, right? Like somebody's actually, you know.
I don't know if I already used this comparison with you or with Doug Lane or which show, but here I would like to repeat. Did you notice, and our listeners, how I talk much more slow? I'm more slow now. So at least one effect of my illness is that I'm not so nervous as usually and so on. I would like to repeat, very important what you said. This point of conspiracy theories, which was very nicely outlined by my good friend and comrade in theory, Alenka Zupancic, about how the problem with conspiracy theory is not the idea of conspiracy as such, as many good Marxists, like even the good old Fred Jameson pointed out. Of course, you cannot explain everything today with this famous anonymous logic of the capital, you know, objective social process. There are conspiracies. For example, it's not the biggest conspiracy of all times, but a well-known example in the United States. The dismantling of a tramway streetcar system in LA, in Los Angeles. When did it happen? Early 50s or late 40s? I don't know. This was no spontaneous logic of the capital. It was a coordinated act of federal, state, city authorities, and car industry. They wanted to ruin the beautiful, efficient public transport. At the same time, they invested billions into building new highways to make people buy more cars and so on and so on. So there are conspiracies. But conspiracy theory is not just this. You know what's the first irony? I love it, of conspiracy theorists. Did you notice how they all begin with quite a reasonable line of argumentation? I don't know how it is in the States, but in my country, their first line is always use your own head.
Oh yeah, do your own research.
Do your own research.
Yeah.
Don't just believe authorities. No, and so they portray the opponent as one big agent, a combination of pharma industry, health authorities, and so on behind this. But their starting point is to portray the opponent as one big dogmatic force, motivated, you can put here a different accent, motivated either by simple economic interests, healthcare industry and so on, or by, in different combinations, this second one is more deployed by Giorgio Agamben, or by the need or the urge of the state to establish total control over our lives. Okay, but it's so interesting how they, conspiracy theorists, begin with this: do your own research, think with your own head. And we have to proceed here, I think, in two steps. First, what do they mean practically by do your own research, don't believe the big media, and so on? For most of us, let's be frank, do your own research doesn't mean become a scientist. Let's be very brutal. Go to Google and search.
Right.
And of course, what a surprise. If you go to Google and search COVID conspiracy, you will get this. You will get conspiracy theories, which ordinary people absolutely don't understand. But somehow it is efficient. Second thing, did you notice this, that although this is a big conspiracy theory, which incidentally, it's also a nice proof how false is the postmodern thesis. With this, I will say the thesis that the era of big truth is over, that we have now multiplicity of competing truth and so on and so on. COVID deniers begin in this way: don't trust one authority, there are multiple approaches, let's test them. But they always end up with a mega version of big truth, you know. There is one big truth. So it's a return with in an incredibly violent forum of one truth. But nonetheless, at the same time, this is what amuses me. This truth nonetheless acquires many different forms. We have, I don't know how it is again in the States, but I think it's the same. We have 3, 4, 5 even different forms. You begin with COVID doesn't exist, it's invented. Then they say it's just like a minor flu, it's not really dangerous. Then they add vaccines are really more dangerous. So the true cause, so they admit the reality of people dying, suffering, but they claim it's healthcare itself, which in order to profit more causes this. Then you have the theory of a Chinese plot, a theory of Bill Gates implanting chips and so on and so on. So this reminds me, I already used, I think, this in one of my texts, of this wonderful, endlessly repeated, I know, old Freudian jokes of the borrowed kettle. You know, first, I never borrowed a kettle from you. Point 2, it was already broken when I borrowed it from you. And third point, it was intact when I returned it to you. So you enumerate too many arguments which are mutually exclusive. That's what you immediately note with COVID deniers. But as you said, and Alenka Stepancic developed this nicely, it is as if this anti-COVID and anti-global warming conspiracy theory is a kind of negative theology, not negative in the sense of no God, but negative in the sense of bad, evil God.
Right.
That is to say, since today we are so cynical and skeptic that we cannot imagine, it sounds pretty absurd today, a good God steering us towards a more harmonious future, or whatever. You know, this God of what Hegelians are accused of when Hegel talks about cunning of reason. No matter how bad things are, take time, you will see even what appears to us a catastrophe serves some higher good. We obviously cannot afford, very few of us, this type of divinity. Although I almost liked them, Taliban in Afghanistan have still, or pretend to have, I'm always skeptic, this type of trust. Can I tell you, maybe you also saw it, when Taliban entered Kabul, a journalist approached a local Taliban commander, and he used a nice metaphor. He said, you in the West, you have watches, excellent electronic watches. You have watches to measure time, but we have time. That is to say, we are in no hurry. We know God is controlling everything. We trust the future. Time is on our side. Okay, we cannot afford that. So what we do is then the opposite. Better an evil God than no God.
Right. Exactly.
That's the point. You know, at least, and you know how strong this impulse is. Even, I don't know to use this term, but I will say for the stability of your psychic life. When I was in Israel, I learned there of a group which is not negligible, about 100,000 people, who think that Holocaust was the divine punishment of the Jewish God, Jehovah, for the Jews who became too decadent, unfaithful to their religion in Europe. So it was a deserved punishment. I understand them, because better this than no meaning at all. The horror is no meaning at all. And that's, I think, what's the ultimate lesson of conspiracy theory. You have a perplexed situation. No, we need just to tell a story. Again, to repeat my old joke, this wonderful in English double meaning of the term plot. Plot means what's the plot of that movie, narrative, and plot means, like in Jewish plot, conspiracy.
Yeah. So it's better.
Conspiracy theory means that the only big story, plot, in the narrative sense today, it's a conspiracy theory. It's this type of plot. Better evil God than no God at all. And that's, for me, the best argument for atheism today.
Right. Yeah. So I think that thinking about this, it's actually a good transition to the question about alternatives to capitalism, because at least one motivation historically for wanting a post-capitalist society is the idea that all of these things that are actually just, chaotic under capitalism can be brought under some sort of conscious, collective human control. I think when we're thinking about things like global, COVID and global warming that require an enormous amount of coordination to bring them under control, that helps make that motivation, which is like maybe a little bit separate from motivations that are about justice or equality or democracy, although it might be related to them, but it helps you really see that one. But this is something I've been really curious about for a while, because when I'll see you use the word, communism, and that's a word that means a couple of different things to different, groups of people, right? I mean, of course, one thing that it can mean that I know you don't mean is just like the sort of what used to be called actually existent socialism back when it actually existed, and so that's one meaning. And then there's another meaning that, like, I think our friend Doug Lane would probably, like really mean this, right? Which is like the sort of extremely optimistic idea of what a socialist society could look like, that you could eliminate all, markets and money and, not have the value form That's like another thing. But I suspect, and tell me if this is wrong, right? From trying to sort of piece together the threads of things I've heard you say about this, like, let me just say this and tell me how what you're saying fits in, right? So like when I think about socialism, like socialism can mean at least a couple of different things, right? So people sometimes talk about like sort of doses of socialism within capitalism, like social democracy. But then you could also talk about a kind of socialism that would only come after capitalism, meaning that you had something other than private individuals owning the means of production, stock ownership, and all that stuff, which is consistent.
I know this is Varoufakis line. Yanis Varoufakis line.
Yeah, the sort of thing that, So Varoufakis's position is probably that we could overcome
every individual employed by a company should get one stock, should be stock owner.
Yeah, so that's one version of it. So like that would be like the John Romer, Yanis Varoufakis version,
yeah, of course,
which is just like extremely spread out kind of stock ownership. Another version might be that you could have like at least we could nationalize like the finance industry, and that you could have public banks that might give out loans to worker cooperatives, and some things maybe would be socialized, but some things would be run by worker-owned firms. And one way or the other, you'd still have some markets, right? But you wouldn't have a society that was divided into a class of workers and a class of capitalists anymore. And so this is obviously not a complete recitation of all the options, but I mean, like, I think that at least gives people a sense of the lay of the land about what some of the options are. So when you say communism, like, what do you mean, and how does it kind of fit into those options?
I must admit that I use this term mostly in a negative way, not negative in the sense that I don't want it, but negative in the sense that I think that the term, which is now, at least in some circles, publicly accepted, democratic socialism, is for me doubly problematic. I tend, it's crazy position, but I will try to explain it. I consider problematic both terms. Socialism means today in left liberal circles something so relatively neutral, benign, non-radical that no wonder that I didn't check these things, but I at least read that guys from Bill Gates to Elon Musk at some point proclaimed themselves as almost socialists and so on and so on. And what they really mean is not any meaningful abolishment or even limitation of capitalism. What they mean is simply more concern for the social good and so on and so on. Now, when I hear this anti-egotist logic argument, I tend to explode. To use my bad taste metaphor, if I were to be Joseph Goebbels, I would burn the books which claim this. We live in an egotist, individualist age. We no longer have a sense of common good and so on and so on. I think, wouldn't you agree that the problem with capitalism is not that it's egotist. Maybe it produces egotist individuals, but not in the sense predominantly of private pleasures, as already even Marx saw it clearly. A fanatical capitalist is ready to sacrifice his health, everything, just so that the capital goes on, brings profit, circulates, and so on and so on. In this sense, I think we should understand Walter Benjamin's famous designation that capitalism is a new form of religion. No, it is this. It's not egotism. Just there is something that you care much more for what you care, much more than for your own private individual happiness and so on and so on. So I think as it was already formulated by Marx, if we really want to overcome capitalism, God save us from any appeal to the common good, sacrifice for it, don't be egotist. I think we should appeal precisely to the, I'm sorry for this term, healthy egotist interests of the people. You know, who is, for me, I don't know if this is a myth, but I read that when California was still doing well, some 10 years ago, was it Jerry Brown or who? The governor raised taxes, but capital didn't escape because many capitalists saw this as part of a good calculation. They don't enjoy living in private gated communities. They saw that if you invest more in public safety and so on, they will get better quality workforce and so on. It will even profit them. So I would much prefer egotist calculation. The problem, before I answer properly your question, would you agree with this? The problem today is that we get, that's why I'm also skeptic about the term socialism. We get too much of what I call abstract anti-capitalism. If you somehow portray evil capitalists who pollute, poison people, profit, and so on, the desire beneath all this is usually a desire for a sane, good, normal capitalism. I will give you the ultimate example, which I love, provided to me by my good friend Alex. It's too complicated a Korean name to pronounce it all, but he just visited me here from Seoul. He's now on a European tour. I told him, are you crazy in this situation? I mean, of Europe being the same. But what he told me is this. Did you watch some of the Squid Game episodes, or you know the story? Okay. Probably most of our readers know what it's about. In a desperate country, people who are deeply indebted go to some suicidal game, worse than Hunger Game, to get money and so on and so on. And he told me a beautiful, ironic story, how North Korea celebrated this series, North Korean media, they didn't show it there, of course, but in the media, as a realist portrayer of what life is in South Korea. People ready to go into deadly competition just to pay their debt and so on and so on. But Alex, my friend, by some chance they live close to each other. He knows the guy who created Squid Game. And he told me, hey, you know that this series is Netflix's biggest success, but not in South Korea. There, it's not so famous. It's in the West. Second thing, it's not perceived there as anti-capitalist. If you look closely at the narrative of the series, what bothers the hero, who then, at the end of the first season, I think, decides to investigate further who are the people behind, is that it's really an unfair game. That it's not really a competition where with luck or quality you win, but that some people are cheating, it's not, and so on and so on. So the desire
that's so grim, right? Like justice would be a fair version of the Squid Games.
So the desire that sustains it, okay, deadly competition that makes life meaningful, tense. It's not the usual boring reality. Why not? It's tension. You risk your life, but it should be a fair game. That's what we have, and we get a lot of apparent anti-capitalism, which effectively functions like that. Incidentally, Can I go into, I promise you it will amuse our listeners.
Yeah.
Another thing that I learned from my friend.
Yeah.
Now
I
this will be.
I did just want to say, this is, I was actually talking about this the other day. I love Bernie Sanders, but this is why it bothers me when Bernie Sanders uses the phrase a rigged economy, because that makes it sound like.
Sorry, which economy?
Oh, when Bernie Sanders uses the phrase a rigged economy.
Yeah.
That's why it bothers me. That's the exact thing, because the implication is that if the game wasn't rigged, it would be okay, right?
Yeah,
you know that
precisely. Yes.
That if he was living in poverty and
you
he was
see,
successful and all
here,
that was
Marxism
according
or communism begin, where you accept, but it doesn't mean we should not use market. We should nationalize everything, but nonetheless, we should accept that the capitalist game is in itself as such rigged, in its very form. It's not that it's a neutral game and then some bad guys twist it. But you know, I more and more like, when I to avoid a misunderstanding, I mean it's horrifying and I cannot sleep because of these horrors. But it's very important to understand what goes on in North Korea, because I think more and more than North Korea is a kind of a perverted mirror image of our normality. First, did it ever intrigue you? And you will see how this will help us to understand this point ourselves. You know, we are informed in our media from time to time that North Korea propaganda is totally crazy, that they claim that their leaders don't shit and urinate. They are so pure that they have no need to do this. Then they claim that, for example, there are dozens of examples like this, that when their first leader, founding father, Kim Il-sung, died, even nature entered a state of mourning.
Right.
Thousands of birds approached his grave, just came down flying above the grave and just cried there. So even nature was in mourning. And okay, I will not go into other stories like this. There are numerous, but we usually react to this in two ways. Either we claim people maybe believe it there because they are so crazily brainwashed, you know, or we claim this is just one big masquerade, a joke. People silently, but they're afraid to say this publicly, laugh, don't take it seriously, mock it, and so on. I was convinced by Alex, my friend, and by some other guys that none of these two versions is true. So what is? He told me, and he read a couple of books which are published in North Korea itself, repeating all these legends. Birds descending, crying, the leader doesn't defecate, and so on. And they are never reported as literal truth. He told me that it's something like folkloric tales. Everybody knows they are not literally true, but they are a nice myth which you have to use just to show respect towards the state. So it's a very nice example of how ideology works and why we shouldn't project our opposition the way we have it between truth and fiction on them. Maybe we should even understand our religions like this, like Christ dying, then rising from the cross, as this type of folkloric tale. The problem, nonetheless, here, and now comes my favorite legend, is that, nonetheless, the problem with this type of folkloric truth is that it nonetheless imposes such a crazy, for our measures, and I tend to agree with this here, level of respect for the leader that can generate ridiculous results. I will tell you one. Now, so that people don't starve too much in North Korea, they allow out of Pyongyang in the poor countryside local markets for local food products, for like flea market, for whatever you have at home, even a little bit for smuggled iPhones and so on. From time to time, somebody is arrested, but they tolerate it. Then a young lady, basically a late teenage girl, did very well on flea market and earned a lot of money, cash, banknotes. In North Korea, you don't trust the state banks. You never put money into the bank. So what she did is she put a bunch of banknotes into a plastic bag and hide it beneath the earth at her garden of her house. Then the police, it's not clear known what happened. Somebody denounced her or what. The police discovered this. She was arrested and condemned. But now comes the miracle. For what? Not for illegal black market trading, for earning money and so on. You know what she was condemned for? The banknotes were not well isolated in this plastic bag, so humidity, water penetrated them, and they got a little bit humid, rotten. So the banknotes began to decompose, sticking to each other. But remember, on each banknote, of course, this is North Korea, there is a drawing of the leader. So she was condemned for disrespectfully treating the image of the leader. My God, isn't this something? To have a state like that, you know, these are the problems. But unfortunately, I think that this type of folkloric functioning of truth and all that, isn't it this what you came pretty close to with Trump in some sense? It was no longer a question of truth or not.
Well,
what he was saying. Sorry,
people who defended Trump, like there was a certain kind of conservative who wouldn't try to defend everything that Trump said, because they'd say, look, I know a lot of this is ridiculous, whatever, but they thought there was some core there that was good. Like what they would say is, well, you have to take Trump seriously, but not literally. And that's the and that kind of thing is the same as what you're saying with these like North Korean like propaganda narratives that'll sort of mention these myths, and you're not exactly supposed to take it literally, but like it's supposed to tell you something about how you should feel about the leader. And so I guess to sort of circle back around to think about like, all right, so if we're trying to not be like that, you know, we're trying to be really specific about what we mean. So there isn't that sort of gray zone where all this bullshit can exist. Like you say that, you know, when you talk about communism, you know, you mean that in a negative sense, that like in other words, tried to change society in some way that's deeper than what people usually mean when they talk about democratic socialism, that you're trying to, you know, at least like negate like whatever it is that's most bad or that we're most able to get rid of as about capitalism. So I wanted to see if I could drill down into that a little bit, because
let's do.
So what are the, you know, so if you think that perhaps, you know, not literally everything could be nationalized, or maybe we'd still need some markets because of you wouldn't want to repeat the sort of problems that existed with, you know, Soviet bloc economies, you know, the 20th century. But what are the parts of capitalism that actually could be negated in some sort of communist future as you'd see it?
Okay, here I tend to agree with Varoufakis with his other thesis that, and I think Joe Didin also wrote a book on this, that we should gradually learn to drop the term neoliberalism, which I always consider useless, basically. What is really happening in our societies is that we no longer have this wild market competition and then big corporations ignoring the state. No, we have a new fusion of mega corporations and state power, which I think basically nonetheless justifies the term corporate neo-feudalism. Let's look at a figure like Bill Gates. I mean, or all these new corporate guys, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Tim Cook, Apple, and so on and so on. This is my old thesis, but I think it's true. Marxist critique of capitalism was that it privatizes the commons. The commons is what should be, since we all need it equally, should remain not so much nationalized at our common disposal. And as we all know, the big push towards capitalism in England was precisely the privatization of commons, common land in forests and so on, where everybody could go together, would kill animals if necessary, and so on and so on. But I think it's my own thesis that what is going on now with these new mega corporations is two things. First, Marx couldn't imagine the privatization of commons themselves, not in the old sense of the forest is no longer common property, that one guy, capitalist, gets this part, another guy, another part, but that commons remain commons in the sense of we all have to use them. But as such, they are privatized. That's what's happening today. Not total monopoly, but nonetheless, you want to buy books, music, whatever. Amazon is not just another company. It's like a feudal master. In what sense feudal? In the sense that de facto, you don't have a big choice. You have to go through them. That's why another point which runs against classical Marxist vision, classical capitalist progress is characterized by a passage from rent to profit. Before it was rent, like what you gave to your feudal lord and so on, then it was profit. You made as a free individual, formally free, a deal with the capital, blah, blah, we know the story. But today we are returning to rent. Again, it's my old question, why are guys like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and so on so tremendously rich? And they are getting richer and richer. I think the source is not exploitation. Probably, it's even probably true that like Bill Gates employs just a couple of thousand of people and maybe even, I don't know, pays them relatively well. The profit is not there. The profit is in the rent we are all paying him. The same is with Google. Google is for search our commons. And by clicking on Google and so on, we enable then the company to earn money and so on. There is a truth in this, that we are entering a new centralized, highly centralized feudal logic. So now my Marxist reading of this, but my God, doesn't this mean that the old thesis of Marx, which was usually mocked up by all revisionists, beginning with Edward Bernstein at the end of 19th century, that Marx wrongly predicted the growing centralization of capital, that small companies still thrive and so on and so on. But today, something like this is happening in certain domains, like personal dating, exchanging, Facebook. As we saw with this latest informant who went public, like that lady from Google, no, from Facebook called Haugen, I don't know how, no? They, to be able for Zuckerberg to do this means he acts as our feudal master. He determines the very, and gives a false spin to the very field of our exchange. We exchange notices now, but sorry, talks, whatever, but this very space of our social exchange, of our commons, is privately opened. So I'm returning to the old Marxist thesis. It's crazy that with this passage to neo-feudalism, capitalism itself is already moving to a very weird state, which is, on the one hand, neo-feudalism, but this neo-feudalism is an inverted form of a possibility of communism. At a certain point, and the demand is getting stronger and stronger, it will become clear. Sorry, during the last year and a half of pandemic, Zuckerberg, or I don't know who of them, without any great creativity, new forms got 50 billion richer.
Right.
Which means wealth no longer measures, in the capitalist sense, your ingenuity, productivity, whatever. So
it's just IP,
what
right?
I think is that I don't care if it's the classical nationalization or not, but some kind of social control will have to be established there. So that would be my thesis. Capitalism is already in retreat. And now I will tell you something
so it's just
that
a
makes
question
you
of what's
cry.
going to replace it.
Yeah, will it be, as Varoufakis put it, something even worse than capitalism,
Right.
where our freedom itself will be incredibly more manipulated, controlled, or will be a new form of, nonetheless, I call it communism. Communism in the sense of not just social control, because capital is already doing the job of us, concentrating everything. Buying books and so on with Amazon, social contacts here, search and so on with Google. We just have to establish, and I'm careful here, I didn't say nationalization, because, you know, I lived in a communist country and I know how the state can also
I mean,
become.
I think maybe we could have nationalization of the tech companies if it happens in the context of a democratic society with robust civil society and all that stuff. But
no, sorry, just to conclude. You know what's here my idea? Now I will gain many new enemies for saying this.
Excellent, yes.
That maybe, I'm the first to admit, listen, I'm not fanatically anti-market capitalist. At a certain level of local products, creativity, ingenuity, market competition plays a positive role. Undoubtedly, you must be under pressure to produce things, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. I think that while I strongly disagree with how they are doing it now, the Chinese.
So this is what I was going to ask about.
Yes, strong authoritarian way. But what I think that very wisely, they reacted against, not against capitalism as such, but against this neo-corporate threat. Which is why it's very important that now, a couple of weeks ago, I read that they established, apart from the big Shanghai and another one, a third big stock exchange dedicated to small and mid-level companies, dealing with them, supporting them. So what is China now doing? It's very interesting. It's trying to rescue what's productive in small mid-level capitalism, trying to stop this big corporate neo-feudal trend. Now, the way they are doing it, I don't agree, because it's, unfortunately, for my taste, too close to what I call soft neo-fascism. You know,
Yeah.
the idea is that let's have capitalism, but controlled by some patriotic national unity.
But I mean, I think the interesting thing about China is if you, I mean, if you think, right, so I think something we agree about is that you probably do, for now, right, maybe in the 23rd century, you know, that computer technology will be such that we can plan these things in a much more efficient way than, you know, blah, 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 maybe, right? You know, but like for now, right, you know, you do need markets for some things to sort of coordinate production with consumer goods. But, you know, we should have, you know, social control, maybe, you know, nationalization of, you know, the commanding heights of the economy. And there are certain ways in which, I mean, I think any kind of socialist, you know, critique of capitalism is ultimately, I mean, I think Vivek Chibber puts this really well, right? That it's not that even if you're not like an abolitionist about markets, right? You know, you think that there are, you know, the sort of basic socialist core capitalism is still that, like, critique of capitalism is still that, you know, markets need to be rolled back at least in some areas, both that we shouldn't have to rely on them we shouldn't have to rely on them for our basic needs, and also that the way that the labor market, you know, forces up to give up our autonomy in the workplace, that's also bad. But if you think about, okay, so the kind of like market socialism that somebody like me or somebody like, you know, your friend Varoufakis, you know, not that those are exactly the same, but I don't think the details matter right now. Like that, like in some ways, at a sort of level of 10,000 feet bird's eye view, China is sort of doing what we want, right? Because there's a sense.
That's the paradox. It's prohibited to say this. Yes, it's horrible what they are doing with Uyghurs, with social oppression and so on. But there's a lot of now serious. They are not cheating with global warming, ecology. I spoke with some friends there discreetly, and they told me not out of any goodness and so on, but they were just the party controlled the information. We didn't learn enough. For example, they had so many too much rain, not enough rain. The last year, 2020, and now this was catastrophic for their agriculture. So they have to take it seriously. So now I'm coming to next stop. Don't be afraid. This is where I move beyond socialism. Socialism is for me like the dress of AOC, tax the rich. This goes up to a certain level, but it's not enough. For me, what we should do is, listen, people are gradually getting desperate how to control not only COVID, but also global warming. And let's not fetishize global warming. Never forget that there are other forms like pollution of the land and so on. It's not just, it's the typical mistake. It's not just global warming. It's not that this is a new form of fetishism, this 1.5 degrees. No, there are other ecological problems, but you know which debate are now alive in England, for example. I read, friends sent me the link. And not by some crazy leftists, but middle class people who worry and so on. Some of them came to the idea, which is my favorite idea, because I hate cars, to slowly move to about like shared ownership of cars, gradually abolishing cars, which appears nightmarish, but they said it, not some hardline communist. Second thing, they are even talking about new forms of rationing. For example, we all know beef, eating too much beef and pork, especially beef, is a problem. Because it's not part of the natural balance, if there is such a thing of Earth, to have so many cows. This brings great imbalance. Now, the market solution would have been, okay, raise the price till the demand drops. But this is horrible. This would have meant we return to 17th century. I read somewhere where in England, even before the division was strict, beef, even pork, mostly were for the rich. It was class distinction. I can give you a proof. We also have it in America. If you talk about the meat that you eat, you use the term pork. If you talk about the living animal, you say swine.
Right.
You know why? Because ordinary people were dealing with swines. The rich people who at that point, mostly in the court, spoke French. Pork is the French term. This is what they were eating, pork in French, you know. So the only alternative to simply allowing the market to do the job, raising the price incredibly of 4, 5, 10 times of beef is rationalization. And it doesn't mean necessarily any nationalization or whatever, and so on and so on. It's clear that it will have to be done. That's why I agree with those. And I'm not a utopian who claim that this Glasgow meeting was a failure. I'm very pessimist here. They simply didn't take the crisis seriously enough. There were these big humanitarian speeches, blah, blah, blah. But if you look at the results, so what's my conclusion here? I will tell you immediately, it's a very sad conclusion. It's that obviously we need much harsher crisis to awaken us, really. That's my sad conclusion. But sorry, another thing, why I also don't talk only about nationalization and so on. We already mentioned in our past conversations, I think, a point, very important point made by David Harvey, who opposed not even the capitalist, but the valorization perspective. The idea is, yes, when you pollute environment, you are doing horrible things to environment. So the idea is, let's translate it into value. And if you pollute, you should pay for it. And they applied this to everything. Like, for example, women are doing homework. So, okay, when you have a child as a woman, you should get additional. But this is, I think, just the universalization of market principle. And solution helps. I think there are whole domains like health, like environment, and so on. And we should move further here. Some basic common standard. Again, health, environment, basic food, and so on, which should be devalorized, not in the sense of cheaper, but in the sense of exempted from market competition and price being determined by the market. We should return to socially owned commons. I don't think the solution is global market where, and you know that some guys even proposed, I like them because I like extreme guys. They proposed that even air should be commodified in this sense. The air on the earth is worth, I don't know, billion, trillions. So every of us should pay tax on breathing the air and so on. No, it should be commons.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'm very pessimistic about bad crises necessarily leading people to draw the right conclusions. But I was going to say on the China point, if you think, okay, well, if nothing else, for all, you know, like China proves that you can have an economy where at the commanding heights, you have a lot of state ownership, a lot of state, planted, at the upper levels, and has this thriving economy that's been incredibly successful, et cetera. So, I mean, I I think that the real question is whether you can have all of that without the the
Without,
authoritarianism, without the
my
crazy
answer
economic
is
inequality that exists in
yes.
China,
Yeah.
etc. Right? So,
but my answer is yes, and I will tell you why.
Yeah.
Because although by they I mean, if there are anti-communists today, it's Taiwan and South Korea.
Yeah.
Although they are politically strictly opposed to China, they are moving in the same direction. Although they are still formally democracies, state controls capital and so on, posits limits and so on. So, but I agree with you. The big task today, and this is the challenge for all of us, I'm not pro-Chinese communism, is can we do what they are doing, but can we do it even more efficiently in different political forum, more democratic, but not necessarily in the sense of parliamentary democracy. That's another debate that we didn't enter now.
Yeah.
How to save what is worth saving of democracy, but nonetheless stepping out of the limits of typical multi-party democracy. Because as Chinese friends explained to me, their privilege is that since they don't worry about next elections, they can afford to plan for decades in advance. And although they are formally democratic, but all top examples, even of efficient capitalism today, Scandinavian countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, they achieved this level of social consensus that they agree about global goals. And they are very open here, the Chinese. Their problem is how to prevent now the ecological fiasco, social unrest, and how to become the leading world power till 2050 and so on. Their problem is not, will we win next elections? No?
Yeah.
But I think that we should do better.
But at least you do have the Scandinavian cases where they've accomplished not all of the same things, some of the same things, even with multi-party elections and all that, and also in some ways with much more economic egalitarianism than China. I mean, China has
has the greatest number of billionaires now, more than United States. But the leadership is wisely aware of this. But one should be very careful here. It's not an attack against capitalism and market efficiency as such. No, it's an attack against this neo-corporate feudalism. And I think that we should be here, what I like to call myself, principled opportunists. Principled, we see the basic deadlock. Opportunists in the sense of, even if we have to make strategic alliances with local, if they exist, but let's say, local productive capitalists, just to contain, to prevent this neo-feudal system, which is, I agree with Varoufakis, what is emerging now is much worse than capitalism, at least capitalism at its best, welfare state capital. You know what, to conclude, I will give you a simple example. A couple of days ago, I think, Bill Gates, I don't know, did he make a speech or whatever, it was reported, where he said, we will need 15 billions of vaccines to 2-3 times vaccinate everybody and blah, blah, blah. Okay, I agree with him. Just what horrified me is he is just a stupid billionaire. How can he occupy such a place of, how should I call it, common wise guy? Who is he telling us? This should be a collective decision, political, of all of us. Why is he doing this? Saying something evident.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, the fact that he's in any sort of decision to influence public policy at all, that he's considered a major figure in these debates, just because he's sitting on a huge pile of money. I mean, I just finished this article for Jacobin about Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos, who, like one of the things that really struck me about that is that part of the reason that Theranos was able to do what it did is that if they'd had to go through institutions, I mean, even like capitalist institutions, like just big banks, right? Never mind like government research grants or anything like that. They would have had to go through this process where they would have had to try to prove a lot of their claims about how the machine had worked and all that stuff. But the reason that Theranos was able to exist and be so successful for that long is that all they had to do was find some like individual rich people who they could like who Elizabeth Holmes could charm, and she could tell she could make it sound like she knew what she was talking about, and that would be enough because they didn't have to justify themselves to anybody. They could just make those investment decisions just by themselves. They could write a check, whereas even a loan officer at a bank, never mind somebody who worked at like the National Institutes for Health or something like that, would have had to file a lot of paperwork, showing that there was some reason to think that this was going to work.
No, so again, I agree with you. I'm well aware of the problems here. I don't want to, of course, to discredit democracy as such. But what I am saying is that in view of the problems we have now, global warming and so on, and the absolutely obvious need of some kind of self-control, social regulation, and so on, what I'm dreaming of, I'm much more desperate. It's not new type of communism where we will all be happy. No, long time ago I renounced that. Life is shit, life will be shit, and so on. Well, but nonetheless, it can be shit in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I always like the Corey Robbins thing about how, the way we should think about socialism is what Freud said about the point of psychoanalysis, that the goal is to reduce hysterical misery to ordinary unhappiness.
Yeah, things like this, yes. And another thing, this tendency towards communism, as we see, it's not we are doing well, why not better, and so on. I'm a communist not because I dream about better society, but because I look around and see the shit we are in, and I'm just thinking what people, not just leftists, implicitly admit that it has to be done. The problem with Glasgow is that they all know a global cooperation is needed, but they are not ready to do it. But they know it. This is the communist agenda I'm talking about. It's, as I often repeat, it's a war communism. It's a communism in a desperate situation. It's not, consumerism is not enough, it should be more higher, spiritual, or whatever, and so on and so on. And another thing, let me conclude, very important for me, is, and that's, I always repeat this, but I think with new anti-COVID resistance, even in Europe now, it's very important. People, more and more, are not ready to abandon what they consider their normal, everyday way of life.
Right.
We will have to learn to change our everyday customs measures. I'm not talking so much about COVID, all of us wearing masks, but how to fight global warming and so on, limitations and so on and so on, limitations on consumption, on travel maybe, and so on. I'm, for example, quite for limiting private travel, not abolish it, but limiting it. Like go to United States 3 times a year from Europe, but not more, whatever. Because I read somewhere that's incredible. Like one private plane, does one flight on a private plane from Europe to United States does more damage than if you never in your life recycle newspapers, and just throw them. I mean, I'm sick and tired of this private moralization. Did you recycle your cans and so on and so on. Yes, I'm doing it. We should be doing it. But that's not the point. The point are, again, to quote Alenka Zupančič, it's not depoliticization. What serves the best those in power today is this cynical attitude. Politics is corrupted, fuck it, who cares, let's stick to our private life. No, as she put it, we don't just need emancipatory politics, we need emancipation of politics. Now we have just paranoid politics, who is the enemy and so on, but emancipation is political act. It needs visions, which must be creative visions. It's not just an objective scientist will tell us what we have to do. It needs invention. It has its own risks. So against those who claim, oh, everything is too politicized, no, I would say we regressed from politicization too much. That's why this dangerous...
we regressed from politicization to moralization. That's
the big... No wonder, you know what's the result? I always suspected them, these new age guys, inner harmony, Ayurveda, transcendental meditation. But now I read a couple of reports that they are more and more moving into COVID skepticism. Like, it doesn't matter, don't trust health industry, your inner peace, meditation, and so on and so on. And this task will be to abandon this, our ordinary way of life, is an extremely difficult one. It cannot be decided in an old-fashioned democratic way. I don't even know how to do it. Maybe we should rehabilitate what they pretend to do, but not really in China, or what they did after 2008 and even before with this new crisis in last decades. We need maybe new social pacts in the sense of larger coalition. People in Finland and Sweden told me, why did they survive this last crisis till now, at least, relatively well? The government simply brought together trade unions, banks, industrialists, administrators, doctors, and they made a plan. The plan was clear: how to make necessary cuts, but guarantee that welfare state will survive. They made a social pact, large majority supported it, and they did it. It succeeded. Maybe we should rehabilitate the notion of coalition, because and that's the real problem, if you ask me, with this new right-wing populists like Trump or similar figures in Europe. Unfortunately, the differences are so radical that you cannot do this with them. They are pure figures of radical split. You cannot make a pact with them. So I'm not saying let's talk with everybody. There is a level, yes, at which somebody will have to win.
I would say the problem with right-wing populism is that it's all bullshit. There's no actual, populism there. It's just like, if you actually look at what they advocate, there's a lot of populist rhetoric attached to it, but Trump was doing deregulation. He was doing tax cuts, for rich people.
That's why I like the metaphor that I used in one of my texts, lamb to the slaughter. The true success of Trump was that precisely some poor white people were like lambs voting for how should they enter the slaughterhouse as fast as possible.
Right. No, I think so. I think that and I think some of it was people who believed the populist rhetoric, but some of it was also just nihilistic. That this goes back to the thing about, you should take Trump, seriously, but not literally. That I think some people were very self-aware about how nonsensical a lot of what Trump said was, but they didn't care.
Who is my favorite idea here? Who was that Trump supporter who was brought to court for claiming that elections were rigged and all that. And you know, this is the supreme point of cynical irony for me. I forgot her name. She will be mentioned in my next book. You know what was her defense? But wasn't it so obvious that what I was saying cannot be taken seriously? So I shouldn't be protected. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think
believe
probably a lot of
my
people at the grassroots. I mean, it's not like they sort of know that Trump is lying about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of it's nonsensical. But what they really care about is that at least he's triggering the libs. You know, at least he really pisses off the people that we hate. You know, which I think in a strange way goes back to the point about how we've retreated from politicizing to moralizing because it's the flip side of the like liberal version of culture war that's all about trying to sort out who the good people are and denouncing the bad problematic people. That it's just the other side of the coin. That it's like, no, these liberals really annoy me, and all I really care about is hurting the people that annoy me. You know, that like because
Absolutely.
people have given up on the idea that they're actually politics is actually going to be a vehicle on any kind of structural level to help them with their lives.
But here we should show to the people how Trump is lying here. For example, with Facebook, no? Mm-hmm. It's obvious.
Sorry, the last like 45 seconds got cut off. But there are like 2 sentences about Facebook, and then we say goodbye. He is going to be back on the show, I believe, in January. We're trying to figure that out to talk about his new book, which I am looking forward to. Always a really fun conversation with that guy. But meanwhile, want to bring on our very good friend Matt McManus from Canada, which is closer than Slovenia, so we can do this live.
A little bit,
yeah.
Colder also. We had snow for the first time today. My wife is already deeply upset about that and is like shuttered herself in the apartment.
So she's already, so Matt's wife is from Mexico. She's already past the point of like thinking that it's a cute novelty, and now she's just annoyed by it.
Yeah, well, you're from the north also, Ben. You know that like snow is cute for like a day or two, and then it becomes the devil's pellets, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I actually this last year since, God, for like the last like 20 years, with very few exceptions, right? I mean, I'd like go back to Michigan at some point, during the winter, like for like a couple weeks for a visit, but like actually like living back there for a while when we were, teaching online because of COVID. It's like, yeah, there are like a few weeks in December where it's like, oh, this is awesome. Like this looks so cool, whatever. Like, I'm kind of enjoying walking the dog and this and all that. And then like sometime by like late January, it's like, oh my God, this is never going to end. It's just awful.
Yeah. I mean, appropriately enough for a conversation that's probably going to entail at least some discussions of white settler colonialism. When I moved back here from Mexico, back to Canada, one of my first thoughts was, I just don't understand how any fucking person came here, settled in Canada, and was like, you know what, we're just going to stick around after their first winter. Like, I would have sat here for like an hour and just been like, goodbye, back to France, back to Italy, wherever, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, or you could do the spicier version, which is something I'll admit that I've said many times over the years, which is that I don't understand how the original, indigenous tribes migrated south. Yeah. Like it's so sad that they gave up hope this early, that they stopped here, and just keep going. It's like, no, come on, guys, keep the faith. Like a few more weeks of trekking, it'll be so much warmer than this.
No, just fucking get to the end of the Niagara Peninsula. It's like, a few more weeks and we can hit Florida, right? We'll stop there. That's enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to see you. Good conversation, by the way. Slavoj looks like he was in a very good mood. Talkative as normal, but it sounds like you guys covered a lot. China, COVID, communism. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing about I think that the Squid Game take, that it's that there's the stuff about the rigged economy. It's like just saying we need a fairer version of the Squid Game, and doing and the riff about doing your own research, and how that means like going on Google until you find one website that confirms what you want to say, what you want to think. I think we're definitely going to have to clip out both of those.
Did you ever see Candace Owens' debate with Joe Rogan on climate change?
No, I didn't know this. I didn't know this existed.
It's one of the funnier things, because when Joe Rogan looks like an intellectual head heavyweight, you know that you're really in for a treat, because he's sitting there and he's like, "You don't believe in climate change?" She's like, "Look, I did research for like an entire night on the subject." And he's like, "Yeah, but you do know that there are people who study this for decades, and 97% of them say this is a real thing." And she's like, "Well, this isn't the hill that I'm going to die on, but like I really did my research. Like I spent a whole evening on the subject, reading article after article about it, and I don't know, I just come away with the conclusion that it's, there's still a lot of questions left to be asked about this." And Joe just like drops his jaw to the floor and is like, "Okay." So like, to me is like the paradigm case of that. It's like, I basically am as well researched on this as climate scientists. I spent a good evening with a hefty cup of coffee going through the material.
Yeah, it was like a whole pot. That's exactly how much time I spent researching this, and decided that like 99% of climate scientists are wrong. Yeah, no, honestly, look, Joe Rogan is all over the place. He's got some very bad takes, especially lately with the vaccine stuff. But and usually, like whoever he has on, right? Whether it's like Jordan Peterson or Cornel West, like he'll just sort of like sit there and sort of genial stoned agreement. It's like, "Oh yeah, bro, yeah, good point, yeah." But like when he
good job.
Yeah, no, it was good work if you can get it. But oh wow, yeah. But when he does, like every now and again, when like a right-wing guest says something that's so stupid that he pushes back, it is a thing of beauty. I mean, the classic, of course, is the one that's the one that's quoted in Against the Web, the thing about the post office and deregulation.
Yeah.
But like there's also a really good one with Dan Crenshaw, where Crenshaw says that if you have a right to health care, then you're saying that doctors should be slaves. And and Rogan does like again, it's just very satisfying to watch, because he's just sort of doing the sort of mad on the street, like how any normal person would react to that statement. It's like, wait, really?
Well, it really goes to show you how being kind of rhetorical bullies is a big part of the appeal of a lot of like libertarian figures, because when he just sits there, he's like, "No, I don't know exactly how that will work." And it's like, and Ruben's just like, "Well, the free market and competition will kick in and that will just solve everything." He's like, "No, my dad was in construction and I know a lot of these people, they can be really grifters. They use cheap material. How would you prevent that from happening without regulation?" And he's like, "Well, I just don't have all the answers to that. Maybe your house will collapse on you. Maybe it won't. But I just know that whether it does, there are more important things than your life and the life of your family. And that's allowing the market to work its magic." So.
Yeah. I mean, the really admirably honest answer was the one that, when Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute went on the Majority Report, which I will, take credit for setting that up and connected them. But like, at the end of it, like Sam, was like pushing him on like the condo collapse in Miami, and Brooke just like bit the bullet. He was like, "Look, I mean, no, I don't think there's any rule for government regulation stopping this from happening. And ultimately it's the tenants' fault because they didn't do better research on like what the safety practices were at this building, before they moved in."
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't want your house to collapse on you, why didn't you just look into it with a lot more detail and a lot more energy? Better luck next time.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like I said, it's admirably honest. Less admirably honest is this very odd opinion that was just expressed in the Washington Post. I don't know that I'd say dishonest exactly, because that suggests it's intentional, and I don't know what was going on here. But I think we have a graphic of there we go. That's the article, The Danger of Critical Race Theory. You already know it's going to be good.
That's for sure.
So then this is how it starts. All right. By now, most Americans have heard of critical race theory, but many do not know just how radical or pernicious CRT is, because, as a new study from the American Enterprise Institute shows, the media does not explain its key tenets in its coverage. Now that, so far, so good. I mean, I think this much is true. Like, it is objectively true that that most people do not know what the key tenets of critical race theory are.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, do most people who comment on critical theory know very much about what critical theory is about either? It's become a placeholder for pretty much everything, from Marxism to a bunch of annoying students who demand extra foam on their Starbucks coffees, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, especially, yeah, I mean, critical, like the whole critical theory Frankfurt School thing, which I actually got my younger brother, I gave him a copy of, I don't know if you've read that book, Grand Hotel Abyss from Verso, but it's anyway, it's a fun book about the Frankfurt School, so I gave that to him for his birthday. We were talking about it, when we were Skyping last week, and he was just talking about how amazing it is that, Frankfurt School has this role in all these people's imaginations as the like font of all evil, and this sort of like conspiracy of revolutionary communists, like doing this like 300 stage plan, to bring down American civilization. It's like, you actually read about these guys. I mean, man, other than Marcuse, who's at least, like hooked up to the new left, like these were the most like dismal defeatists, like ever came out of, although came out of is the operative term, the Marxist tradition, it's like, yeah, I mean, Adorno wasn't like planning out, like, here's my plan to bring about communist revolution in America. He was like, writing grim screeds about, how like, fascism was inevitable in our psychology, and, jazz music is, is like, bad because people like it too much.
I know, and the Beatles are a sign that Western civilization has collapsed. I mean, one of the beautiful things about reading a lot of right-wing media, as I do, and I know you do as well, is it's really empowering if you're a kind of a leftist intellectual, because you feel like, God, I really have my arm on the lever of history, right? And single-handedly, my books on critical theory that I thought just a few dozen people were going to read and comment on are actually going to just move society in oh so many directions. And then I go back to the real world, and I'm like, oh, I can't even get my students to actually bother doing their readings on an everyday basis, because even if I'm marking them. So it's very empowering and nice that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I asked one of our nation's preeminent historians, Princeton University's Alan Guelzo, to explain CRT and why it is so dangerous. Keep that in mind when you hear what comes next. That this is one of our country's preeminent historians. I don't know if Canada has historians this good. Critical race theory, is a subset of critical theory. Already kind of wrong, but whatever. It gets so much wronger by the end of the sentence. That began with Immanuel Kant in the 1790s. What? And it gets better.
That was just, I mean, at that point, I looked at that statement and I was just like, I had no idea that when I was reading the Critique of Pure Reason, it was really the critique of woke reason. And I was being indoctrinated with that. And indeed, everyone's been indoctrinated with it since the 18th century. But man, oh man.
Yeah. It was a response to and rejection of. All right, sorry, got to roll back that part of the tape. It was a response to and rejection of the principles of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason on which the American Republic was founded. Kant believed that, quote, reason was inadequate to give shape to our lives, unquote. And so he said about, quote, developing a theory of being critical of reason, Guelzo says. Yeah, I remember, so when we were like getting together the graphics for this, our graphic designer, Jandra World, like said like, oh, this is sloppy. It says Guelzo says twice in that paragraph. But I'm actually kind of glad that they included it the second time, because I would not want anyone to think these were quotes from Kant.
Well, don't you remember in undergrad philosophy, Ben, when they told you, Kant is an enemy of reason? He continuously insists that you should just do whatever you want and let emotion rule your life. And really, you're not under a duty towards anyone except the quivering masses who need to be compelled to overthrow the rich. It's Kantianism 101.
Yeah. But the critique of reason ended up justifying, quote, ways of appealing to some very unreasonable things as explanations. Things like race, nationality, class, he says. Critical theory helped spawn totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century, such as Marxism and Nazism.
Yeah.
Wow. Which taught us that.
Well, I mean, hey, listen, Adolf Eichmann used to say he always acted in such a way that he could will whatever the Fuhrer willed in his own actions. So I guess we'll just take his word on it, right?
Yeah, which is actually kind of fun as an example, because Eichmann's defense that he was just a cog in the machine is sort of the opposite of that. But let's see, which taught that all human relationships are relations of power between an oppressor class and an oppressed class. Yeah, I mean, that's bad enough as a description of Marxism. That's bizarre as a description of Nazism.
I know it's also really odd that he seems to be conflating all of these things together. So really, the argument that whites have been oppressing people for a long time is analogous to the argument by Nazis that Jews are oppressing them. And it's also analogous to the argument of Marxists that the bourgeoisie or the capitalists are oppressing. So really, any kind of argument about oppression whatsoever is just tantamount to Nazism, or at least flirting in the same family of discourses.
Yeah, for the Marxists, it goes on, the bourgeoisie were the oppressors, for the Nazis, the Jews were the oppressors, and today, in the 21st century America, critical race theory teaches that whites are the oppressors. So,
yeah.
Okay. CRT, all white people instinctively white supremacist, Guelzo says, adding, I say instinctively because this is not a function of reason. It's a weird, anyway, whatever. The idea that that's like a exhaustive list of human motivations, that you're either using your reason or you're acting on instincts, is fairly strange, right? Like, I mean, if nothing else, like culture exists, whatever.
I don't know if it's that strange. And I mean, we're going to get into this, but I'm starting to get a sense from the flavor of this that this is a guy who's overdosed on an awful lot of Ayn Rand, because it's got her fingerprints all over it.
This is why its advocates talk about systemic racism, a CRT term that has crept into our public discourse and has even been embraced by President Biden. Systemic sounds like systematic, except of course it isn't. Guelzo's whatever says when you try to find some systematic, then you have to go find evidence. But systemic implies something so deep and instinctive that you're not even conscious of it. There's instinctive bias that's built into people of certain colors. CRT rejects democracy as a relic of Enlightenment reason, Guelzo says, and argues that white people use tricks like democracy and the search for truth to exploit and dominate people of color. Okay, we've got the rest of this, but I think we could just let that stand for the whole thing. So, yeah, as you point out, right, Marxism, Nazism, critical race theory, etc.
Probably start throwing Jesus and Moses and anybody else who opposed oppression in there as well, right?
Well, that's the thing, right? Because this is just the Jordan Peterson thesis that postmodernism, by which he really means like green-haired college kids yelling about pronouns, which is actually a phenomenon that has little to nothing to do with postmodernism, but whatever. But what he means by postmodernism is the same thing as Marxism, because well, various groups, white people, men, cis people, straight people, are like the capitalists oppressing workers and the views as groups, which means that anybody who's ever talked about oppression, right? The authors of the Torah, the Book of Exodus, everybody in the French Revolution, like Marxism predates Marx by all of human history, according to
the democratic socialists in Germany who said they were being oppressed were like the Nazis, everyone. We just get completely circular with this.
Exactly. So, but this is actually even worse than the Jordan Peterson thesis, because at least he had the decency to not try to lump the Nazis in with this, which is just fucking amazing. So,
and I mean, at least Jordan Peterson has some respect for the Western canon, as long as it doesn't go too extreme. So, I can't recall any point where he decided to drag poor old Kant's reputation into our endless culture war debates.
Right. And presumably he wouldn't, because I think even Jordan Peterson, honestly, is probably enough of a great books guy that he probably knows a little bit about what Kant thought.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, like, he might, like at the very least know that that not only was Kant not rejected Enlightenment reason, Kant was one of the central figures of the Enlightenment. That Kant is the guy who wrote the manifesto for the Enlightenment, like literally.
Yeah, I mean, he was probably, I don't normally say this about Kant because articulation wasn't a strong point, but the most articulate propagandist and polemicist for the Enlightenment in that essay.
No, exactly. Like
so much so that people to this day still criticize him for being almost too pro-Enlightenment, for emphasizing reason at the expense of so much else.
Yeah, that is the usual criticism of Kant. That he's like that. He doesn't want to talk about anything other than reason, but there are all these other things that are important, and and he has this sort of dogmatic Enlightenment, like view that that misses all the stuff about the human experience. And yeah, I mean, Kant is usually not the clearest writer. I always like, there's a line in The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. I used to quote this on syllabi, where he said that basically he's justifying his writing style. He says, look, I could try to, slight paraphrase, right? I could try to dumb this down for you, but I'm not going to do that. Other people later maybe can, popularize this, but, I want to give you real philosophy, not this is an exact quote. This part is an exact quote. Idle coffeehouse chatter. That's his defense, and he's sticking to it. But like in that essay on the Enlightenment, he's actually very clear and lucid, and it's like talking about how enlightenment means that you don't basically subcontract your conscience to priests, and you don't let authorities do your thinking for you, and it's all this celebration of that, right? Like, so.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I should say my favorite quote from him to that effect is actually in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Titles usually weren't his strong suit, where he bitches about the 1981 version of the Critique of Pure Reason, and he says, I knew this was a tough book, and I was going to get a lot of complaints from everyday people. But when I got complaints from other academics who one should expect, would be willing to deal with a difficult work, I got really frustrated. Because, you should have all just, grinned and dealt with it like I had to when writing the thing. So here's it for you, a little bit dumbed down. Don't ask me for this again, basically. It's like the most cantankerous thing that he ever wrote. And, part of me was like, yeah, it's a great book and everyone should go read through it if they're interested in the history of philosophy. On the other hand, anyone who has gone through the book has at least spent a few moments wanting to throw it against the wall, being like, I just can't do it anymore, right? Like, I'm never going to get through this thing.
Yeah, for
you think
sure.
to yourself, he maybe have had a little bit more sympathy for his readers down through the centuries who have had to crack that nut.
Yeah, and honestly, people who, I mean, again, the funniest thing about this is people who really do have, I mean, nobody has quite the views that are attributed critical race theorists in this essay, because it's like a silly caricature, but like the people who are the closest to having the views that are being described in this essay don't tend to be big Kant fans for exactly this reason, like people who are really into standpoint epistemology and stuff like that. That you sort of deferring to oppressed groups and not thinking that you can reason in a universalistic way about everybody and whatever. Like Kantian liberalism is often the way they'll label, right, the thing that they don't like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, 100%. And I was going to say, I had an Arc Digital piece that came out not too long ago where I talked about how Kant has had an influence on critical theory. And I stand by that because it is absolutely true. Much like Plato has had an influence on the history of philosophy. Yeah. So if you were really going to be insistent about it, could you draw a through line from Derek Bell down to Kant if you were being very, very general? Probably, right? But the reality is that Kant stood in many ways for what many of these figures oppose. There's this kind of universalistic conception of the individual that's at the epicenter of his thought. He is a skeptic of certain kinds of reason, but he does believe that there can be a formal system of rules put in place, both by the individual and at the political level, that will work to the betterment of everyone, and that can be fundamentally meritocratic in its orientation. And last but not least, to kind of undermine his pedigree as a critical race theorist, I have a lot of love for
racist.
Kant. He was a horrible racist. Just like all you really need to do is go through his lectures on anthropology. By the way, a guy who never left his hometown but felt free to lecture on everything from Indonesia to Africa to South American cultures in really embarrassing ways. Right? It's cringy. And near the end of his life, I'll give him some credit. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing Kant. He did start to become more critical of imperialism and colonialism. Both saying it was bad for the Europeans and bad for the people that they were domineering. It was never gave up a lot of his parochial views about the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean,
all of them were kind of immature and not to his taste.
Yeah, he wrote a bunch of super racist stuff about non-white races, and then had second thoughts about some of it. It's unclear how much, right? I think that would be the fair thing to say. But so it's yes, in that sense, his actual views about race could not be further, from critical race theory, but also his views about Enlightenment reason and everything are certainly very distant from the silly caricature of critical race theory given here. I mean, I'll just say really quickly, we did a whole segment about this a few weeks ago. I don't know, several weeks ago, but critical race theory is originally a legal theory that I think starts from a just undeniably empirically correct premise that having legal equality between the races is insufficient to get rid of deep racial disparities in all sorts of institutions and outcomes, right? I mean, that's just obviously true. Look around you. I think that where there's room to criticize the sort of next steps after that are, okay, what's the diagnosis of why that's insufficient, and then what's the prognosis, right? I mean, what's the prescription, for what to do about it, right? And so you can certainly have arguments, a lot of the Derek Bell stuff seems to assume that the main issue is lingering, racial prejudice, which is certainly part of the issue, by people in power, positions of power. But there's also the sort of critique that people like Adolph and Torrey Reed and Cedric Johnson will make. The Field Sisters. There's this whole other camp of Black radical scholars who will say no. The prejudices certainly exist, but that's not the main problem here, right? The main problem is just capitalist property relations preserving the outcome of past systems of discrimination, right? So that's a substantive.
Kimberly Crenshaw has actually been more and more explicit about that point since 2016, where she increasingly talks about how it is that it's not just an issue of systemic prejudice, but the fact that white people, frankly, in the United States have accumulated generations of wealth and capital, which naturally advantages them when competing for certain positions, certain forms of status in the social hierarchy. and her argument isn't, of course, that we should take that from them because of resentment, but we should try to level the playing field to make sure that there's a more competitive kind of system where people can rise to the top on their own merits rather than being advantaged in this kind of way. And I actually have problems with that as a Rawlsian, right? Since my argument is
exactly.
more anti-competitive and anti-meritocratic than hers, but it's a legitimate argument to make, and I don't think there's really any denying it from an empirical standpoint.
Yeah, again, I think the empirical premise is clearly correct. I mean, I think the Rawlsian criticism is obviously right, and by the way, it has a core of Kantianism in it, right? But but it's also okay. Yes, that's like the anti-meritocratic point, is a good one, and then there's also just the sort of like Marxist sociological point that. I don't know, like there's a Marxist sociological point, and then there's also a good old sort of Rawlsian or sort of Marburg neo-Kantian kind of point to be made about what the goal is, right? Like is justice having a system where exactly the right demographically correct proportions of people of each race are living in poverty, right? Or is justice doing something about the poverty itself, right? And again, this would be the point that the Reeds and Cedric Johnson, the Field Sister, people like that would make, which is that, certainly true that the people at the bottom of society are disproportionately non-white because of the incredibly racist history of our society. But, there's a real question about whether you want to focus on the disproportion or you want to focus on the economic inequality itself, right? So these are all sort of like legitimate debates to be had if you start by knowing what CRT is.
And I should say its genealogy is actually a lot more American than anything that you would find in this article, right? You can really trace it back, oddly enough, to American legal realism, which is a very popular legal theory that started in the 19th century. Pedigree is people like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Jerome Frank. And basically all that they said, if you want to boil it down to its simplest, was judges do make law, and they're always going to make law. And people, at least like Holmes, had no problem with that because they'd say, I'm a lot smarter than the average person. I'm a lot more educated than the average person. So it's a good thing that I make law because people will be better off. Now, if you know anything about Holmes's own jurisprudential record, which includes, sterilizing mentally handicapped people, you might be a little more wary of that. But
3 generations of idiots is enough, right? Yeah,
exactly. But then it transitions into critical legal theory, where actually I kind of came up in, which is its own kind of interesting tradition of legal scholarship that gets its head started in the 1970s with people like Roberto Unger, Duncan Kennedy, Pierre Slag, a bunch of others, and then critical race theory really only comes to the fore in the late 1970s, early 1980s, after the civil rights movement, where there's a lot of questions about what should radicals do now, with a lot of the critical legal theory people saying it's time to move on from the racial struggle and to focus on an economic struggle. A lot of them were basically Marxists, even though they weren't being overt about it, because Marx was kind of a taboo name. And the critical race theory people, I think, rightly said, no, we can't just decide to put race aside and decide to focus on struggles for economic equality because systemic racism is still very, very prevalent. And in fact, it intersects with economic oppression in the United States in very particular and very interesting ways that, we're talking about.
I mean, so I think a lot of the, I think oftentimes people end up talking past each other because systemic racism really does mean a couple of different things. And sometimes, even in the hands of people a lot smarter than the author of this article or the historian is quoting, those things sort of run together in an unhelpful way, but like one thing systemic racism can mean is like the prejudice plus power, definition. And that's, undeniably, part of the problem. I actually think the empirical evidence for that is overwhelming. If you look at studies of, like identical job applications where, where one person, has a stereotypically black sounding name and the other one doesn't and stuff like that. But I don't think it's the main problem, right? I mean, I think the main problem is the one that, all those figures mentioned earlier are identifying, which is just that like, that if you have, if you have open, de jure, discrimination up until, time that, that our parents were in high school, then, or, not too much before, then you, of course, are going to get, even if you could magically eliminate all the racial prejudice from everybody's heads, right? Like it would still be the case just from normal capitalist property relations chugging along, people who are born into poverty are more likely to end up in poverty than people who are not born into poverty. that's a pretty basic sociological fact. And that applies to people of all races who are born into poverty. And so, of course, if people are, non-white people are disproportionately born into poverty because of America's apartheid history, that's going to go there. But I think it is also worth going back to the other thread there that you referred to a few times. We never really made explicit, and maybe we can end on this. That okay, in a way, it's so weird, right? Because usually when people are getting Kant wrong about this stuff, they're getting it wrong in exactly the opposite way.
Yeah.
That they're missing the fact that Kant and other Enlightenment philosophers did not think that reason could do everything. That's the usual mistake. That's both the Steven Pinker mistake, in his books, the Enlightenment, and also the mistake of a lot of critics of Pinker who says, Pinker, these Enlightenment philosophers,
did you read his latest book, Rationality?
No, I assume you did.
I did. I wrote a review of it, and let's just say, when it comes to talking about things like critical thinking, there's some interesting stuff there from a psychological viewpoint. When it comes to stuff like moral and political philosophy, at one point he says, we should endorse something that's kind of Rawls's original position, or the categorical imperative, or maybe the principle of utility. One of these could probably work out well.
There's a pretty big range there.
And I was just like, well, yeah, why don't we just throw in, the will to power? That sounds okay too. Or philosopher kings, we'll just do something like that. All these people sound pretty reasonable.
Yeah, right. So there are big differences between these, and this is worth spending a second on, right? So because the sort of reason that Kant thinks that there are certain kinds of built-in limits to is this theoretical reason, that you can't. You can't, he's not an idealist in the sense of thinking that there aren't things in themselves separate from our perception of them. But we did this zillion part series with you and Rusty Brigley and Ryan Lake, where we got into a lot of the nuances of this. But, basically he thinks that there are things in themselves separate from our perception, but there's a sense in which we can't know them outside of these categories that are necessary for us to sort of process and understand them. But the whole point, in a deep sense, for Kant of that sort of critique of theoretical reason is to sort of make the world safe for practical reason.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to put limits on reason to make way for faith, which can sound like a defense of anti-Enlightenment values, but what he's talking about is faith in moral reasoning, and ourselves as moral lawgivers, free moral lawgivers, right? Yeah. And I think this is really an important point to actually stress where a lot of these terrible ideas about Kant came from, because like I said, there's a genealogy of them also in American political thought on the right, and a lot of it goes back to Ayn Rand, who once upon a time, I guess, went and picked up, The Idiot's Guide to the History of Philosophy, read that, Kant said something about this noumenal realm, decided that means that we should sacrifice ourselves for the noumenal realm. That's what Kant's moral thought is, and then saw, he influenced Hegel, who influenced Marx. So really, Kant was a proto-Marxist. And he wrote this long diatribe about how he's the most evil man in history. You said that we need to sacrifice ourselves for this noumenal realm. And this was a form of altruism, where all modern altruism finds its basis. And he was an enemy of enlightenment. And terrible as this idea was, it somehow still keeps creeping up quite regularly on the American right. Ben Shapiro made reference to it. Charlie Kirk made reference to it. Probably without ever having read anything by Kant. Yeah. But even somebody like Stephen Hicks makes exactly this argument in his book about postmodernism, where he claims that he's an enemy of reason and a proto-socialist and a proto-postmodern and all these things. And the kind of constant thread seems to be with all these figures that anything that's not committed to this extremely cheesy variant of epistemic realism that somehow also bequeaths an equally cheesy theory of absolute moral certainty, which leads to a further cheesy theory of absolute moral certainty in the virtue of capitalism, is somehow a deviation from the standards of reason. And it's really a shame because, of course, one of the great things about Kant is precisely how he's very dialectical in his approach to things. Reason has a lot that it can do, but there are limitations to it. But these limitations are also productive and allow us to do other things.
Yeah, and just to hit the crucial point about this, one of the things that reason very much can do from Kant's perspective is help us figure out how to live. I mean, that's like the main thing that reason can do. You know, that like so I mean, that's like the biggest, like that's the biggest thing. I think this article, I mean, quite apart from the idea that, you know, critical race theory is anti-enlightenment and blah blah blah, right? You know, like that's the biggest thing this article's wrong about, that Kant thinks that morality is an extension of rationality.
Oh, absolutely.
That you know, that what it is to act morally is you act on the basis of like reasoning about the moral law, which is the same for absolutely everybody, and you know, and we could derive, you know, just from reasoning about it. And in fact, to the extent that you are acting on instinct or sentiment or, you know, blah 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 blah, you're not really acting, you know, from the moral law for its own sake, which we can derive, you know, like as if it were math, right? I mean, like that is Kant's view.
And the funny thing is, this was parodied for its kind of hyper-rationalism even in its day. Schiller wrote a couple of lines about Kant that are really funny, where he says, oh, you know, I was sitting there and I was being really nice to my friends, but then I realized I was being nice to them because I have affection for them. And I decided the only thing that I could do to be a good person is to actually hate my friends. And if I hate my friends enough, but I still am kind to them, then I'm acting in accordance with the moral law, so I can claim to be a good person, right? And so it's just baffling, right? Because even in his day, the kind of sentiment was that Kant is just being way too much of a hard ass about this, right? That the only reason that you can obey the moral law is based in reason itself. If you're doing it for anything else, doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but it corrupts the purity of the goodwill acting according to its duty, right? And there's a lot of things that are good to that, and we talked about that in the whole thing. But it comes at a steep price, because a lot of people have pointed out, and a lot of very good philosophers have pointed out, that this raises the question of moral motivations, right? Well, then why should I choose to do my duty in the first place, right? What's my reason for being reasonable, as it were?
Right.
Kant doesn't really have a very good answer to that, but...
And there is something like in the Schiller thing that is like a really obvious intuitive criticism of what, you know, I mean, it's like, this is Bernard Williams' point, you know, one thought too many, that like if you you know, you're having a nice boat trip with your wife Marion and she falls off, and even if it only takes a split second, if you think, oh my God, I should say, well, hold on, let me make sure, does the categorical imperative command me to save her? You know, that's like, you know, that like that there seems to be something morally objectionable about even having that thought, right? Like what we want is for you to just act, you know, on the basis of your moral sentiments in an immediate way. I mean, even in this sort of like much lower stakes case, right? You know, like I'm in the
horrible thought, like she's on fire or something, and I'm like, well, just hold on, right? I gotta dwell upon this first and ask myself if I could will this to be universal law. Then I'll get back to you with the hose. It shouldn't take that long. Just let me run the calculation here.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, whatever. I mean, and we're both people who think that despite all of these very good objections, there is still like a core that's really compelling.
Oh yeah, definitely.
In Kant's moral theory, which, you know, which I think is, you know, I mean, I think that there's, you know, it's complicated, but I think that, you know, more or less there's a version of that, the sort of underlying thought that finds its best expression in Rawls, and then, like, you know, have a little, you know, have a few corrections around the edges for the stuff that Giacomo was right about, and, you know, and you've arrived at the truth. But that's you know, that would be my take anyway. But
yeah, I agree. I just want to say also that I do think there's a strong anti-ideological dimension to this insistence on just acting according to laws that you give yourself. That people sometimes underestimate, because one of the reasons why he criticizes heteronomy is because of this anti-conservative disposition, where he says, look, a lot of people say you should do what tradition tells you, because tradition is the kind of root of all wisdom, and if you just act according to it, you're more likely to get at the right answer. Now, Kant's not anti-traditionalist in the sense that he says, you know, just smash everything, but he does say if you're just uncritically sitting there and doing what other people or what tradition tells you to do, then you're kind of abstaining from your responsibility to be free and to will the universal law according to the dictates of your own reason without being influenced by all that. And so there's definitely kind of an anti-ideological dimension to this that I think is sometimes underappreciated, even though, like you said, it's a kernel and it needs to be ballooned and developed by a lot of other people, whether they're talking about Hegel or Marx, down to, you know, our good friend Slavoj, who you talked to. You know,
yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, and I actually think Slavoj is best. You know, there's definitely a Kantian core there, but in any case, so we do, you know, we are running late. We need to get to the post game, but final, you know, this is like the end of the game show. We're picking up the card, seeing if you got the right answer. So for all the for the car and and the vacation and all the money, audience is on the edge of their seats waiting to hear the answer to this. Is Kant a critical race theorist?
No. He was an 18th century racist who had a lot of smart things to say about other topics, but do not go to him for advice on race politics. You will be very disappointed and probably, like me, want to throw anything he writes on the topic against the wall.
Exactly. All right. And speaking of GTAA, and by the way, since we're about to be off for Thanksgiving week, taking a break, and then we'll be back, we're doing a Thursday night debate breakdown this week, but the regular show, we're about to be off for a week for Thanksgiving break, and then we'll be back on at the very end of November. Should mention in December, I'm teaching this 3-week class at Speakeasy on G.A. Cohen's book, Why Not Socialism, and his libertarian critic, Jason Brennan's response, Why Not Capitalism. Should be a lot of fun. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. There's a question in the chat about the 10 Commandments. If you want to hear the answer to that, you're just going to have to be on Patreon, so you can hear it in the post game. When we're going to be otherwise talking to our good friend Gian Bajalan about a very strange PragerU video about how awesome the British Empire was.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. That one's fucking out there. Well, have fun with that. You're gonna need a stiff drink to get through that one.
Yeah, I got it. It's all set, so it's ready to go. Yeah, all right. Thanks, Matt. It's a lot of fun. We are going to go to post game now. Patrons should already have the link. Left is best.